Website. And
Just for an announcement, if anybody needs to use the restroom, it's down at the bottom of the stairs. Feel it out.
I think need to be. Our confession. I think I'm having an I'll wait till our guests finish their conversation. Oh. Everyone.
The gallery. This is the latest in our series of salons here at the gallery. My name is Brian Smith, and I'm on staff here, and so excited to welcome back Louis Sarkozy and Felix Pfeiffer. I feel like we're getting the band back together here. This is a wonderful opportunity to gather and share ideas and just sort of plumb the depths of existence with this guy over here for sure. And so grateful to Louis and Felix for being here. Our topic tonight is the Queen Elizabeth II, her passing, her life, death, and legacy. And to guide us along that path, this is Felix's moment here. I'm sort of relieved in a way to turn it over to him. He's going to moderate the conversation, and look forward to hearing what he has to say about this vital topic in all of its different dimensions. That is his candle.
Oh, yes.
Which this is the Minerva, the protectress
Yes,
of
right.
civilization.
So
That
this
was
is my shrine to Minerva for the evening. Minerva, protectress of civilization. We can find her represented in Murano glass tiles, and tiles at the top of the stair of the Great Hall of the Library of Congress. And I would otherwise like that.
Can you turn it on? It's
On.
extinguished.
Yeah, it's someone's light over there now. I think she's well illuminated. So I'll let that go. Anyway, that's just kind of my sense of humor, and will to the end of the talk. I think at some point. But what was lost? Not Minerva. My notes say Minerva. Minerva wasn't lost, but maybe she was, because I will be positing Queen Elizabeth II as a Minerva figure, which might interest Brian, since he studied theology at the Yale School of Divinity. But in any case, what happened when she died? What was most interesting to me, I was struck by the outpouring of grief and around the world, so to speak, and also the outpouring of admiration at every turn. I shouldn't say at every turn. There were a number of voices from which we have heard that did not share, especially from former colonial places, that the same kind of breed, perhaps, at least. I don't know that I was really sad about it, but that I saw in the newspapers, on television, and what I was hearing from friends. And it was and there was, for instance, a friend, and this is what I think led me to the idea of this talk, was the wife of a friend in California. I heard from this friend that she was morose for perhaps something like 2 weeks between the time that she died to the funeral, moping around the house, just really sad about this sense of loss. And this is in California. She was born and raised in the United States. And Matt, my friend, couldn't really understand why she was so sad. She had never really been that interested in either the royal family or even Princess Diana or the Queen. And suddenly there was just this deep sense of loss that she was expressing, or at least showing in her face. And and it got me to thinking, especially when then we saw the funeral and the fact that the funeral, the televised event of the funeral, surpassed all records of televised events in the history of television, with something like over half the planet watching that funeral. And so it was evident to me that a nerve was struck when she died. And what is that nerve? And that's why I proposed this talk today. I will tell you what I saw in the funeral, and why I think a deep nerve was struck, also on the day of the funeral. I was really impressed with the operation that was so vast. It was almost mesmerizing. The use of the Chopin funeral marches, to the beat, to rather the step of the soldiers proceeding along the route. Each aspect of it, the moving operation, was this organic expression to me, in the most masterful way of a culture rallying around its cultural myth, on its own terms, not on the terms of pop culture, not on the terms of a Hollywood producer, but doing it as they do it. And they did it masterfully. And I think they're from the gravitas of what that institution is, could be felt through the music, through the prayers, through all the moving parts. For instance, I was really struck when the American president entered Westminster Abbey. That Abbey is vast. And as he came in, I was really taken by how totally insignificant he and the First Lady appeared. And I'm not talking about President Biden. I'm talking about the American president. It could have been any American president for all I care. But it happened to be President Biden and his wife. Because at that moment, they were asked to hold in their procession up the aisle, while a whole procession of knights of the order of the something or other, the royal household, I think it was, preceded them. Their order of precedence was way back, in this vast ritual pageant
Conglomerate.
conglomerate.
Perhaps it's had negative connotation. It's meant to be that.
Okay, we'll talk about that. But it was fascinating to see from an American perspective that there is something else. I think what struck me was we had the feeling that there's something greater there. There's something greater than the American president. There's something greater than Meghan. She was entirely forgotten. I mean, she had, I mean, the only part about her was that she was there. And she had a seat in it. But there were all these other components to it, that made up what is, to me, the ethos of that, what appears to me to be the ethos of that nation, and therefore its 1,000-year history. Organically woven into a ceremony. And for instance, we're not used to seeing music alone exercised in that way. We're used to experiencing music as entertainment. And here music was used for the ritual of life in an organic way. And that's just one detail that I think added richness to which we're not used, or to which we're not accustomed. And I think it's my perception of the American impression on that funeral is some inchoate idea that this was an experience that goes well beyond anything that we can produce within sort of the culture of entertainment. And why? I think because 1,000 years are in it. And it's not just, as I will mention, the Washington Post referred to everyone being so beautifully costumed and it being a blockbuster event. These are all the American ways of perceiving it. And I would like to push beyond those cliches and what I find to be a pretty limited view of it to see what the ethos is about. And I will introduce the idea of Queen Elizabeth II to frame it in a way that I've never seen framed in the United States. She represented, you have to understand the role of a sovereign previously in European history was that of inseparable from the state. The sovereign was understood to be the state. So to commit treason was to commit treason against the sovereign and or the state. They were not even understood. You could not even perceive that the sovereign as a separate individual from the state. So I just want to put into context that I think that Queen Elizabeth comes at, so to speak, the very end of the line. Maybe the line keeps going. It is so far today. We're a month or two into Charles's reign. So far, it's moving along okay. But she's so far, she was at the end of a line of an institution where you cannot separate the individual from the institution itself.
So just perhaps
Yeah.
a quick pushback. That is a very French conception of royalty, which very much cost our late King Louis XVI his head. The idea that he was the state, that the land, that all French people were his subjects. The English dispensed with that idea quite earlier than the French did, which is probably an argument as to why they conserved their monarchy. Very quickly, I mean, as far back as the 1200s in the 13th century, the English kings and queens were severely limited by the power of parliament and by their nobles who acquired more and more power. So I would say that that conception of royalty is perhaps even looked down upon by the English in the English tradition rather than the French. Which I mean, Louis XIV had this famous quote, "L'État c'est moi," right?
Yeah.
And Louis XVI.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Try to repeat that to.
Yeah.
And we know how that ended.
Yeah.
So I perhaps like put back on your point about English monarchy there.
It does not contradict my point at all. I'm just merely saying the point of origin of English monarchy also comes from that place.
Sure.
That the state is I, or the state is we. And so when the American press or Americans try to read Prince Charles, or I guess now he's the king, Prince William, Queen Elizabeth as individuals, they cannot be understood as individuals in the sense that we prize individuality. And so therefore we see a lot of the, I think the qualities that I heard about Queen Elizabeth, a sense of duty, discipline, dignity, calm, and civility. And hopefully we can talk about those things.
Actually, I think I mean, I'm retired Air Force, but our military says no one does ceremonies. The British military. And the royal family, you know, they try to have many military ties from uniforms to the honorary titles in the regiments. And you can go to Arlington Cemetery here and see very structured ceremonies. It's one of the sad ironies, but one of my friends said that the military does death work. I think it's part of the culture, but I think there is also, there are many views, the Commonwealth view, as you mentioned. But I do think, staying with the military, from the uniforms to the pageantry in the march. There's a view there.
When I turn to Louis, we'll be talking about that because Louis is about to enter the military and he went to a military school. But in any case, she was in essence a kind of like indentured servant in a gilded cage. And the role that she performed was exemplary within that, I think. And it made me wonder when she died, and we kept hearing over and over, duty, discipline, dignity, calm, civility, continuity. Are we missing those things in our own culture today and in ourselves that made us mourn that loss? I know that I'd like to talk to Brian about the idea of the mother figure. My sense has also been a lot of people have felt a kind of loss of a maternal figure because she was there, especially for people over the age of perhaps 40 to 45, when we had an adult life before the internet. There was something really nice about this slow change, this slow and steady of a figure like Queen Elizabeth in the world, someone who was calm, someone who was comforting. I will call upon, you and I talked about it already, the fact that during the COVID pandemic, when our head of state was insulting or berating his scientists or the government scientists and dividing our ideas about how to respond to it, and then further dividing people during race riots, Queen Elizabeth II was patting everyone on the back saying, we're all going to be okay. We've done this before.
If I could come in here.
Yeah.
I think the question that's being asked, first of all, is like, what precipitates this kind of response? What precipitates this kind of like outpouring of respect or love or whatever for this figure who doesn't directly rule you in some way? And I think for Americans in particular, where in theory, the people are sovereign, that's sort of the whole reason we fought the revolution in a way. And in theory, we are the government. And at the same time, we have a president who also in theory, constitutionally or sort of symbolically, is kind of supposed to represent the monarchy. The government, the way it's sort of divided tripartite, it's like we have these kinds of latent monarchical tendencies, latent aristocratic tendencies in the Senate, these kinds of things. But I do, you mentioned President Biden. I did think it was interesting that when we have all of these conflicts, all of these crises, he's standing up and saying, I want to heal the soul of the nation. So basically there's a sacred dimension to the pageantry of the Queen. She in fact is nominally the head of the Anglican Church worldwide. So there's a sense that there's something that we as Americans still need, in that sense of some kind of spiritual value, of dignitas, of duty, of whatever it is that you're describing with the Queen. And so from an American standpoint, why would Americans care so much about royalty? Is it a sense of envy? Is it just a sense of sort of celebrity worship, the cult of the celebrity? I think that's certainly a part of it, but there's something that's sort of that we all still need in this figurehead of value, of dignitas, etc.
Probably try to answer your question, Brian. I should probably let the audience know I was just sworn in as an American citizen.
Yes.
So everything that I say, take with a grain of salt. Very hard to wash the Frenchman away, as it turns out. But nonetheless, I can speak with some authority now that I do hold the wonderful blue passport on these questions. I think, and Felix, you and I talked about this, but there's two Americas here. And there certainly was one, and perhaps we are operating in a bubble when we live in Washington or in New York or in Los Angeles. When we talk about these issues and we look at the millions of people who watched the funeral, I don't think we would get the same adulation if we were to walk the streets of Des Moines, Iowa, or go to Arkansas. I think they have a very different relationship to the monarchy there. And this is a population that is very much attracted to and very close with their original values, which was rebellion against said monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So in a wider sense, there's two Americas here, and I'm not teaching anything to you. You're very aware of how divided our proud nation is. And I think along those lines, mainly rural, urban, you can find this differentiated opinion. As to your question as to the sacred nature and to why, such adulation, I'm sorry if I disappoint anybody in the audience. I did not share your friend's morose attitude when the Queen passed. I mean, for all intents and purposes, she was probably a wonderful woman who performed her role extraordinarily well and with great dignity. But I think the story of your friend exemplifies one thing, is that this is, might I use the word, superficial adulation. It's the next big thing, right? Some of you may use social media. You know that when the invasion of Ukraine happened, suddenly that was the thing, and we saw the filters and we saw the press adulate, and then suddenly public opinion moved away. And a couple months before that, it was, as you said, the race riots and Black Lives Matter was the subject, and everybody was jumping on that, and then people moved away from that. And look, I mean, when the Queen passed away, we thought we were going to hear about it for a decade, and guess what? We have moved away from it. And I think most Americans have also moved away from it. And I think it's a good thing. I mean, I don't think I'm conceding my opinions very well here. I don't hold the royal family in very high regard. I think this sacred nature, as you did mention, they are head of the Anglican Church, is mostly overblown. These are regular people, I'm sorry to tell you, like you and me, who get up in the morning and have their needs and their wants and their jealousies. And by God, do they have their share of scandals. And to quote a popular journalist of the late 20th century, this is what you get when you found a political regime on the family values of Henry VIII. All right, you get sexual scandals and romantic scandals and perversion of all sorts. Not that the late mother Queen, as we said, Grandmama, as she now became, with it seems a large part of the American electorate, she did not espouse any of that. As I said, she must have been a very dignified woman who performed her role objectively, but her consorts and her fellow family members certainly don't live up to her standards, nor do I think her son, the king, lives up to that standard by some of his past declarations.
Well, I think the idea that we would have already forgotten about this event just over a month later is exactly why I proposed this talk.
Happy to remind all of you.
Yes. But it's precisely one of the reasons I proposed this talk, because you live in a world with such unbelievable, chaotic, technological change. I think it was easy for a lot of people to identify with her slow way of going about life as a role model for people. She was, as I was telling your mother earlier, change with a very small c.
Right.
And we can look at her reign and see that they have changed. There has been progress.
Oh, yes.
It's slow. It does not follow a news cycle, and it does not follow an electrical cycle. And I think at the end of the day, it was almost refreshing. And in this way, paradoxically enough, and I think that's why I want to explore the subject, is there something even abstract in the values of an aristocratic mind, shall we say, or a constitutional monarchy that can be a value to us, because everything that is old is new again. It has, like her, I should say, she had the great fortune of surviving long enough that she came out on the right side of history.
Yes, but if I mean, there's no doubt that she was very durable. I mean, a lot of people.
Well, she looked durable.
She was, but And she, I mean, her daily life, I can only imagine, must have been incredibly difficult, but she presided over perhaps the greatest disaster in our country's history, which is the decline of the British Empire. I mean, that is the fact of recent British history. And perhaps the royal family is the only institution which maintained the same prestige as it had at the beginning of her reign. And so while presiding that, we have here this figurehead who seems to embody everything that is prestigious and calm and serene, while presiding over, the collapse of this empire that once ruled. I shall not remind you, a third of the world. So there is a paradox here, and it's not that, how to say this, it's not that hard for her to espouse that role because she's never associated with any of the negatives. Right? She is the dignified, as was famously quoted. She represents everything continuity. She represents, as you said, serenity and pride. There's this famous quote by, I forget who, he said that you can tell a lot from a country which refers to the royal mint and the national debt. Right, so the debt is the nation's fault. Right? The mint and the production of resources, that's the glory of the nation. How hard could it have been? I'm sorry to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I think anybody in this room would have done a fantastic job as monarch with all the responsibilities that the British monarch has to do nowadays. It's not that much, shall we say.
No, I do think it is a lot because it requires, I mean, aside from having your individual freedom stripped to a certain point, it takes a great deal of not just it takes a great deal of humility to fill that role. And it does lead to, over time, a certain amount of wisdom in navigating and steering the vicissitudes of culture as we know it today. And it helps when you don't have to put yourself up for an electrical cycle, an electrical cycle, every so. And I suspect if you follow the basic rules, you could probably make a good monarch yourself. Yes. But
That's clearly what the point he's making. Role.
It certainly was more difficult when you had to lead your own armies in battle.
But
I would simply worry about your rebellious nobles.
I do want to call attention again, though, to the qualities. I think most of us, and certainly most newspapers, most media around the world, seem to agree that she was a woman of duty, discipline, dignity, calm, custodianship, and perhaps most important, civility. She was famous for her husband, not quite as. Her son, who is now king, well, he was Prince of Wales, and now he's king. Let's see how he does. Are those qualities? I just wonder if the American people were touched by her death, specifically because we find those qualities, that idea of like, who's looking out for us? Where is the custodianship of our national culture? It certainly is not at Walmart, or in the interests of Jeff Bezos, shall we say. And what I think is interesting about a constitutional monarchy is it's as if, let us just recall for a moment that the most egalitarian societies, and that's not just me imagining Scandinavia or the Netherlands to be the most egalitarian societies, they have the most egalitarian distribution of income and most egalitarian gender equality, or however one expresses that. And they are constitutional monarchies. So there is something about the role of custodianship. I think it then falls on a more cultural level.
I feel it.
That we don't have in the United States. Yes, Charles.
One point, thanks. I think another factor could be, remember Churchill's book, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples.
Yes.
And I think there's some macro feeling embedded, certainly in Americans, even if they're in Arkansas, somehow there's some relational value that people automatically feel because of the historical relationship of Great Britain and America. And this even goes to the Commonwealth, even for countries that that dearly won their independence, like India, still so much of, let's say, Indian culture, Pakistani culture, popular culture is British inspired. So much of the infrastructure, even around the world, was done. So this feeling of the language, that may be contributory to why people around the English-speaking world
Yes,
were
for
paying
sure.
attention.
Yeah, yeah.
If I could respond to that, thank you, Charles. That's an excellent point. So there's also a famous book written by David Hackett Fisher called Albion's Seed. And it's one of the sort of great texts of American studies. It talks about how, despite the diversity of sort of European heritage that comes to America, we're still sort of English in inspiration. I think that there's a lot of people who have taken umbrage with that fact over the years. But if I could draw a parallel also to that early Republican period in American history, if you all take a look behind you there, that's my hometown girl, Dolly Madison. She is from my hometown, Greensboro, North Carolina. And I think she embodies this concept of Republican motherhood.
Mm.
And this is a very important idea that basically, despite the fact that, after the revolution, there were a lot of people talking about the role of women. Were they going to vote? Were they going to hold their property? All of these issues of coverture and all these other things. What sort of got settled on is that while they don't have active public roles, in the sort of traditional political sense, they can kind of rule the domestic sphere with their sense of civic virtue. And this is such an important part of how we kind of transposed that, queenly or kingly sort of motherhood, fatherhood concept onto the American scene. And that's still, for Republicans today, of course, different ilk of republicanism maybe, but it's still all of a piece with this idea that somehow, the mother figure is supposed to set the bar for society.
And I'm sorry, in that regard, what about the father figure?
Well,
Washington.
yes,
But does it
He was going to
really?
be king.
Sorry.
yes, and he was in fact going to be king.
But what is more important to the Republican tradition? The fact that he could have been, or the fact that he negated the crown and refused it?
George
Well,
III said, if he turns down the kingship, he'll be the greatest man in the world. He did.
I think most
I
Americans.
think a lot of Americans still regret the fact that we don't have that kind of figure. I mean,
I would
I'll
have-
give you an example. I remember in undergrad, to William and Mary, which was founded by Royal Charter, 1693, still has a Royal Charter. The Queen visited in 07 to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Virginia. 10,000 people filled the square in front of the school, which is double the size of the town. No other world figure can hope to do that. I don't even think a president can do that, except for maybe Obama at the height of his popularity. I think that shows there is a bit of a mystical tie between the British monarchy and the American people, even beyond kind of these East Coast cities. Williamsburg is full of people who are not East Coast elites. There are tons of normal people around Williamsburg. So I think there is this mystical cord that goes through the United States that ties us to the crown. And I think a lot of people regret that we don't have it, which is why the funeral is so popular.
Listen, I would never deny that there's no mystical aspect to the British crown. I am going to offer some pushback on the Republican tradition and sort of the regret of having a king. Listen, to quote Thomas Paine, the beauty of the American experiment is that the law is king, right? And that in that you do not have this father figure. And we come from people not too long ago, 2-3 centuries, who despise being referred to as children of monarchs, who despise the hereditary concept. I mean, the idea, to quote Thomas Paine again, that you should elect a head of state based on a hereditary principle is as absurd as having a physician who's chosen based on heredity, or an astronomer. Because I mean, this is and I mean George Washington, who was never offered the crown, to be honest, but it was mentioned by
our politicians by hereditary principle, though. This town is, I work in politics, this town is full of people whose mommies and daddies were Congress people or members of the city council.
Well, you find me in the U.S. Constitution where heredity.
It's not in the de facto.
I can see the point. No, I would have to disagree. I mean, still, we rely on a very potent democracy, which has its problems with not. I don't think heredity is one of our issues. The American cultural myth is very much the civic Cincinnatus, one of George Washington's idols. The man who you go to in times of trouble, and then he relinquishes the crown and goes back to his plow. I think that is just as beautiful a tradition by which to build a country around, rather than rather than a sacred family supposedly elevated to heaven or represented.
That's correct. The society.
Yeah.
Believe in hereditary principle, whether they select it. I think fundamentally you're right. What we hope the absence is of the American Republican experiment, but in reality, it is frequently.
But yet, if an American president was ever portrayed by a cartoonist as a king, you know he's in trouble. That would not be that would not be it would not be a pleasant thing for his comms team that you in politics must know to have your candidate portrayed as a king. And so it was in early Roman antiquity, and the word rex, king, was an insult to people who were trying to amass too much power. I think indeed. I think you're underestimating the American Republican tradition, as I think humbly, Felix, you are underestimating the proud British Republican tradition. I mean, yes, it's true that this comes from a long list of more than some, and people like Shelley, like Thomas Paine. I mean, we're very proud Republicans, and I think there's a vibrant strain of Republican to this day in Albion. And one, of course, that gets talked about less because we are still in the wake of the death of Grandmama.
Well, let me just say that
Perhaps if there was another scandal, then public opinion might have swayed differently.
and I'm not so sure that this is the salient point, but where we are concerned in the United States. But the Emperor Franz Joseph said before his death at the beginning of the 20th century, "My role is to protect my subjects from their politicians." I think some of us feel like being protected by our politicians at this point too. And so I do want to steer perhaps the conversation back to some of the things like that. If indeed Queen Elizabeth II's death and her example, people talk so much about her example. What a beautiful example as a role model she had. Is there something that we can learn about it through ourselves? You already, just earlier before we went live here on YouTube. We're talking about the indulgence, self-indulgence culture in which we live. She was the absolute opposite of that. I mean, not everyone can be that exemplary, obviously, but is it not something? Are there not aspects to take away from it?
You're completely right, and as I said previously, she embodied, many wonderful civic virtues. We must not exaggerate this, though. I mean, she was an incredibly privileged woman from one of the richest families in the history of mankind. So I don't think, talking about walking around in the grandest palaces that the world has ever known. I mean, the world obsessed over her death. I mean, she was a human being. Right, and I think were we to walk down the streets of poverty-stricken, I mean, pick your poison, Baghdad, Kabul, Rio de Janeiro, we would perhaps be faced with another type of humility, another type of pride in hardship. Not necessarily equating the two, but I think this analogy must not be taken too far.
But if we admire it, does it mean are we looking for something that we don't have in ourselves right now and forget about the Queen then? How can we? You're about to go into officer candidate school. I don't think that there are a lot of Americans right now who have a strong sense of duty to their nation. And I'm not, she had no choice about her duty to nation. Actually, she did. Harry just split for Santa Barbara or wherever it is he lives. He checked out. She did not.
Yeah.
You obviously are inspired on some level by the idea of what can say it for me again. Ask not what
Your country can do for you.
Thank you.
What you can do for yourself.
Yeah, so it's a sense of duty that means a lot to you, and you're about to give up quite a bit of your own individual freedom to be in service to your country. Whereas that is not the norm in the United States today, to put it
Yes,
that way.
but this sense of civic duty that I have is very much oriented towards the foundational Republican ideas. There's something very appealing to me about a document. The law is king, right? And in fact,
But the law can't shake hands and show up.
And so much
fire
and so much better. The law also doesn't die, and may continue up to the generation of our children. Listen, this is something uniquely American. This is something that you ought to be proud about, right? You are the first political experiment in history, right, where you managed to get rid of something that took us 2,000 years to outgrow in Europe. This is not to be dispensed with lightly. I mean, this is a secular republic based upon the principle that all men are created equal. I know what you're going to say. There was obviously a major hypocrisy lying at the very heart of that line, but it was eventually outgrown. Right? Please do not dispense with that. I mean, us from the old continent will tell you that it is a very, very, very hard fought and hard won battle based upon the backs of our shared ancestors.
I'm
Refer
not
to your
proposing an article on restoration here in the United States.
and some members of the audience.
Hold on, speaking of the audience, we have a question in the back here.
I wonder whether a lot of this mourning that you describe is more a generalized sense of the end of an era.
Yeah.
This was an historic figure who's no longer with us, and my life is passing by. It is not the world that I grew up in, and I mourn the loss of this. I have this generalized nostalgia. And it's
Wait a second. Wait a second. Tim, one thing that's lost is not de facto nostalgia. You're replacing the value that already becomes pejorative. I mean,
Not necessarily, not
This is-
necessarily.
I mean, I felt after I heard about her death, I felt sad myself, but I don't think that I had any particular relationship with the Queen, obviously. But I thought, oh, this is the end of an era. This is a moment. It's
Yeah.
an historic moment.
And listen, and I'm not drawing a comparison here in any way, shape, or form. But when Stalin died, tens of thousands of people poured into the streets in Russia. And trust me, the Soviets were fully aware that he was a garbage human being and a despicable individual, right? But the people do these things, right? I mean, people go down into the streets when a great man or a great woman, however you want to define great, died. People do that. And by the way, I mean, as I'm sure all of you will know, when a friend of the family dies, you feel this because at the end of the day, I'm sorry to tell you all, ladies and gentlemen, we are all mortal. And when somebody dies, we are reminded of that mortality. And sort of the continued existence of a very old person, such as the Queen was, it gives us a little bit of hope that we too perhaps may share in her longevity. And when she kicked the bucket, we are also reminded that we must as well do so.
Though, is that when the monarch died, the standards were lower.
Right.
So the institution never dies.
Unfortunately, no.
So it is interesting. It is interesting. Look, I don't disagree. In the United States, the monarchy would never work here. I'm just thinking that de facto, there are a lot of things in this country that don't really live up to this Republican ideal that I admire.
But you, I'm sorry to tell you, walking around here in mid-19th century came to the same conclusion. He says there's a million problems with democracies. It breeds envy. It breeds it breeds contempt. It pushes people to reject authority and expertise. Nonetheless, right? What do you compare it to? Do you compare it with the endless centuries in Europe where people were the property of the monarch? I mean, this is insane to me that in 2022 we sort of have to revisit these truths because of the late Elizabeth that humans should not revere other human beings, that no human being is sacred, that there's an inherent hypocrisy in revering these people who are exactly like us and who, in her case, exercised very little political power and, shall I say, presided over the biggest disaster for her nation. Right? But for all intents and purposes, and please, if anybody here is a historian of the British Empire, this was a catastrophe. These people governed the world and lost everything.
Let me shift gears here. I want to ask you a question, Lou. Dave, Dave,
In the vein of this gentleman in front of me, I think in contrast to many other empires that existed in the 20th century, the British Empire declined very gracefully. And I think the reason why that happened was because of the Commonwealth nations and because of this bond of unity that was established between these English-speaking nations which were under British control, which was bound up, as ridiculous as it may seem in my eyes, bound up in the person of the monarch And it made that transfer from a colony to an independent nation, but a friendly independent nation, much more graceful than what happened with countries like Portugal or France, where you had really dramatic, violent ends to empire. So I think in that sense, the monarchy actually was a very successful, because let's face it, the British Empire was going to fall.
But wait a second.
Winston Churchill considered that he had failed in his life's mission to preserve the empire when he died. And can you imagine Winston Churchill, the single greatest war hero of modern history, considered his life a failure? We know this from his own personal notes at the end of his life, because he said, I couldn't conserve the empire.
But it's also,
Who could?
it's all,
I'll take his word over yours,
It's also-
even though I value yours.
it's also considered that, the graceful, wrap up of the empire, so to speak, or,
Graceful wrap up.
in the words of your friend.
Sure.
If your cherished friend over here.
Not cherished anymore.
Simple discourse. Yeah, let me add, let's, I do think we should shift gears here. I want to ask Louis a question. Who do you fear?
Who do I revere?
What is it about those people?
My mother.
And they're
Anybody? Much younger than the Queen, mind you. No.
Yes, and having read their book, I know, on how many levels he disagrees with his mother, but I can say I was very touched by how much you respect your mother. And how you show it in writing.
Well, she is, after all, the reason why I exist. Those things.
Yeah.
To answer your question, and my friends in the room may raise an eyebrow or two when I answer this, but revere is a terrible word. I deeply admire some individuals in history, including perhaps Napoleon Bonaparte. Who is known for what? Who is known for his meteoric rise and then his shattering, abysmal fall, his cataclysmic mistakes. Inherent, in my opinion, in the word revere is an adulation, is rising human beings above sort of the level of scrutiny. This needs to be dispensed with. I mean, all
Right.
the ideas that somebody
Generally
is,
speaking.
generally speaking,
Yeah.
whether it's monarch, I mean,
Yeah.
this is a despicable trend.
Yeah.
I don't revere anybody. I deeply admire people, and the example of Napoleon is particularly important because he really exemplified the best and worst in an individual. The shattering rise, the meritocratic ethos, the ability to see past cultural, racial, religious differences, and then excuse my language, but then to fuck it all up so wonderfully. I mean, everything collapses under his feet, and
It was his
lives-
ego. He entirely allowed his ego to control his.
In many ways, he did. In many
Yeah.
ways, he did. That would be one.
Tamed himself a little bit in that regard. And that is the opposite of what we saw in Queen Elizabeth II. Now, granted, she had no political power, as you said, but that actually brings up something very interesting. What about the soft power of Queen Elizabeth II? What about the soft human touch?
Sure.
And that is also power. I mean, she was in essence, in a way, she described herself, by which she met her role as quote unquote the last bastion of standards. And I find that very I find that salient where she is concerned, because she aspired to represent the best of what Great Britain could be and the best of what her subjects could be. And I am not saying I have not called this talk in order to debate the merits of monarchy and whether it's relevant in the United States. I'm talking about like what abstract lessons, what are the principles in a figure like that can be meaningful to us in our society today. I will though say, and I don't know if it's relevant for you, it did cause me to wonder how exemplary she was at her role, whether our founding fathers had a blind spot in terms of the balance of power. we have the balance of power through the three levers of government, right? And then the Constitution. And when I saw that country unify, rally around its myth through the funeral that it produced, and the unity that they expressed in their myth, and see that our myths are in total tatters. I mean, do we even know what our common myths are anymore? If it's the American dream, it's a joke. And if it's the Constitution, we've got people ready to like revise the Constitution according to their legislative whim, shall we say. And if it's the Supreme Court, we heard from the Supreme Court back in June, and that didn't go very well. So,
But it depends who you ask.
Yes.
yeah, I'm talking about people who agree with me. I will say that was a large part of the population. It does cut to civil rights, things that I thought we had agreed were civil rights. In any case, I have sensed Elizabeth is a sense of ballast in that whole chaos in her world, at least.
It's making me think back to President Kennedy's funeral, which was absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah.
What Jackie Kennedy put together, and then the funeral of Ronald Reagan more recently.
Yeah,
I mean, we didn't have this streaming ability at that time, but it was certainly the same sort of outpouring. You know, he was like a papa, Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
For many, many people.
Yeah.
So and then I've been thinking a lot about Dwight Eisenhower.
Yeah.
And what kind of like president he was, to be also exemplary in his manners and his way of speaking to people, you know? So we do have that. It's just maybe recently, and because of the rise of social media, we don't see it.
yeah. Or the president's not allowed to be it, perhaps,
We haven't chosen.
be his best in his own office.
Disagree about the American dream being gone. I think most Americans, it's still there. And if you just look at a lot of the messaging for Veterans Day, it's still there. That-
Hey,
Yeah, I think on that one.
let's be clear about my sense of what the American dream is. I'm talking about I believe very much in, I think you and I, Charles, share a lot of common ideals and what America can be. I'm talking about that American dream of the house, the two cars, the material dream marketed by advertising companies.
But even
Is in tatters.
But even if I think there's a tendency amongst people, and I'm guilty of this too, we all are to over dramatize the present. And even in that respect, I mean, is it not a fact that we live in one of the most stable societies in the history of man, one of the most prosperous societies, one of the most politically stable societies, where despite some hiccups, you know, the transfers of powers go on, and the poorest among us, although there's still too many and they're still too poor, are richer than 99.9% of all humans who have ever lived. I mean, yes, we can over dramatize. I'm not saying this is Eden. I'm not saying this is the city on the hill. But to deny that the American achievement in our lifetime is not this sort of absolutely incredible thing, I think is a bit short-sighted. I mean, this is a wonderful, wonderful nation to live in. Not only compared to other nations on earth, but I mean, if one were to take a historical comparison, I mean, there's no comparison possible. I mean, this is by far the greatest political experiment in the history of mankind, to incorporate so many different cultures, so many different religions under a secular constitution. I mean, this is an incredible achievement.
It is an incredible experiment, and it is just that, and we're barely out the gate.
And
And
the
that is-
first great commentator who recognized that was Alexis de Tocqueville.
Indeed,
Right.
and he was the first to point out its faults. I mean, this was not an apologist, right? He
Right,
really pointed out,
Right.
but he recognized that there are ills and qualms to all government. You will always have troubles, right? You will always have problems. You'll always have tribalism. I mean, somebody point me towards the government where that doesn't happen, where there's no rivalry. This is to be expected in a democratic system. So the fight is ingrained in the system. By the way, we debate and we advance. I mean, that is how it works. So I think let's not over dramatize our current situation. Is it divisive? Yes. Is it more divisive than the 1960s? I'm not so sure. Is it more divisive than the Civil War? I know for sure it's not. right? There was 700,000 dead in this country over political division. I mean, I don't think anybody can beat that. And I don't think anybody would argue that we've reached that level of.
And I think that that's, the fear people have. Is it not?
An understandable fear
I mean,
nonetheless.
Wrote a book about blue cities, red states, a sort of cold civil war in the United States at play right now. Where now instead of a north-south situation, you've got to disperse across the nation.
Sure.
I'm saying that it does not surprise me why my friend Matt's wife was a little morose. Queen Elizabeth II, yes, did give a sense of comfort and a sense of continuity in a world where right now, it's very difficult. The middle class is very fragile right now. The working class is having a hard time sustaining the way of life as they thought they would have it. Technological change is at play all the time. And there is perhaps a cold civil war going on in the United States right now, so to speak, per my friend's book or article. Maybe it was like a brief for a book or something. But in any case, it's a very sensitive time. And it is not, of course, as dire as the Civil War, but I think that's the fear.
So
We had an insurrection just last year. It wasn't 25 years ago. It was in 2021. That the election was perhaps almost overturned.
Indeed, but the system worked, did it not? I mean,
It worked,
it did
but
work.
but we're all a little. That's what I'm saying.
And I'm not saying it's not understandable, but one must not over dramatize. And I think one thing that you can never get too much of is contextualization. I think that it's one of the very rare things where you can never over contextualize. And I think international contextualization is good enough to make my points. Historical contextualization, and I think the thing is sealed here. I mean, this even with January 6th and the BLM riots and the division, by far one of the most peaceful, stable. I mean, this is not my point. This is the famed Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker made this point in a book called Enlightenment Now, where he said, nothing is as responsible for the good old days as a bad memory, right? And everybody seems to remember the past as this glorified time of peace and stable. When you look at every available metric, education, fate of the poor, the rate of death at birth, every metric that you can possibly quantify to try to see human happiness and human prosperity, this is by far the luckiest time to be alive. This was said by Barack Obama, by the way, a figure I don't agree with, to say the least in many respects, but he was completely right when he said, if you did not know what age you were going to be born in, and you didn't know who you were going to be born as, the color, creed, handicap, no handicap, but you could pick just where and when, right? And you didn't know who on the social ladder, rather, I should say, I'm sorry. He said you would unbelievably immediately pick the United States in the modern age. I mean, what are the other candidates here? I mean, I'm wondering. Not if you like firearms.
A majority of people would, based on kind of assumptions or ideas or material fixation that is natural. I would say that there's definitely, if you spend time in other parts of the world, like spending a huge amount of time in India, far remote villages in India. I know a lot of people who spend time in other parts of South America, something like that, in the forest of the word. And one of the profound things that you experience in that encounter is that the happiness that we have, it actually pales in a way to the simple happiness and joy that they experience in a day-to-day lifestyle in that state.
Yes.
It's the thing that inspired liberation theology.
Oh, right.
The Catholic priests in South America realized from their worship experience in the course of the Lord that there was something there that was lost with the wealth that we have.
I mean,
so
you might be completely right subjectively, but I was more referencing to metrics such as, I think we can both agree, for example, that literacy rates, or something like survival of birth or life expectancy, these are all metrics to strive towards.
So what we're comparing, hold on, David, I'll get you a second. What we're comparing is in fact material and spiritual values.
Yeah,
And so, you know, whatever your concept of the spirit is, whatever your concept of, you know, that sort of happiness quotient, it's a personal relation that you're sort of invoking here. And I think that's what's most important to the context of this discussion, is that it's a person. And, you know, the last time anybody in my family died, 4 billion people didn't tune in. And, you know, there's something there that this person is embodying, is representing. Maybe it's just fame. Maybe it's just celebrity, as I said before. But, you know, it's given that, of course, she is the longest reigning monarch, but not just that, but longest reigning woman. Feminism has taught us, above all, politics is personal. And there's something very personal about the Queen, despite her sort of cool distance, whatever. She wasn't perhaps the most charismatic of royals, but there's something that is, it's a vicarious experience of humanity that is somehow being tapped into, that is like more profound than any material dynamic or material measure. Does that strike you, Simon, as being this sense of what you're experiencing when you're with these people? And in India, I would also say, back to the whole British Empire thing, you know, it didn't just go gracefully. There were people like Gandhi. You know, this is not something that just like, you know, domino effect. I mean, people were involved and people were pushing for something more free, more, you know, more liberatory. And I think keeping it in that personal context is most important for this conversation, in my opinion.
well, and I also think that where the grace, or where any grace was concerned in winding down that empire, so to speak, we have or the world has Queen Elizabeth II to thank, because of the way she did it and the humility and grace with which she conducted herself during those times. But I do connect very well with what you're saying, because you're talking about some of the holistic spirituality of basic human culture, which is very hard for us to perceive in the United States because we're so distracted, to me, by, I guess we're distracted by a sort of consumer capitalistic culture that doesn't allow you to see often the most basic elemental human spirituality, or the sacred and just a simple daily life.
And yet here we are talking about the sacred and the spiritual in a consumer capitalist country, taking time off our days, and we're not spending it watching, you know, Apple products and Amazon deliveries. We're talking about these subjects.
And by the way, everything in here is for sale. So
Yeah.
Things matter, ethics matter, beauty matters, and that to me is what, you know, there's something that lives in these objects in this gallery. There's a spirit, there's a force. Peter, the owner here, he's been dutifully sitting quietly here. I wish he could.
Very difficult to speak with my mouth and have it come out of his mouth. But he's doing a good job.
But yes, thank you. But no, it's I think that may be a good place. Felix, did you have any more?
Yeah, I don't think we, I would just ask you this. In the spirit of augmentation, as opposed to rejection, shall we say, do you think there's anything you could learn from the example of Queen Elizabeth?
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, far from me the idea to say.
Oh, I'm asking you for what that is.
I have
Not to explore it another time.
Well, I mean, there's always something to be admired in one's devotion to one's country. I'm not amongst those who sort of stay nationalism as some do. I still think it's a beautiful thing in some respects, and we're not taken to extremes. And I don't think she did. I think no, as I said, she fulfilled her role beautifully. She lived a life of responsibility, obviously devoted to her nation. But I'm sorry, I don't share this adulation for this person or this family, nor for the institution. I'm very much of the Republican vein, whether that be the French or the English one. And although she lived a life of devotion to her country, I'm not sure I could say the same of your average landscape worker near the Washington Monument, or the customs officer in Bangladesh. I mean, and I don't particularly see her sacrifice and her life as one so incredibly more elevated than the untold millions of regular people, soldiers or otherwise, who also devote their life to their country and who perhaps don't get as much recognition. And as you said, Brian, who don't get 4 billion people watching when they expire, although I'm sure some of them probably deserve it more than even she did.
Do you think there's a je ne sais quoi about monarchy in that regard, where the Danes or the Swedes or the Dutch do find a value despite their egalitarian values? How would you explain that paradox?
Or in spite of. I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
It may
if
be
it's-
illogical.
I don't know if to answer your earlier point, if there is a relationship between egalitarianism and monarchy. I mean, that seems to me.
No. Clearly, there is. It's totally illogical. Like, how do you come to a totally egalitarian society? Not totally. No society is completely egalitarian. But how do you achieve the most egalitarian societies and balance over here the role of constitutional monarchy, whatever that value is?
But there's no
There
doubt.
must be some other quality to it that I think I'm inclined.
It used to be called charisma.
Well, what
And
about
certainly-
custodianship?
Or we didn't talk, by the way, about the particular office of the French presidency, which is very unique in this regard and has often been called a Republican monarchy. I think foreign policy referred to the office as the most powerful in the democratic world. Since the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, the French president is endowed with many more powers than even the American president, and is very much treated like a monarch in many ways. I mean, he is unimpeachable. He's commander of the armed forces. He can appoint every minister and the prime minister. He appoints a slew of judicial and legislative judges and otherwise. And by the way, this also has its negative effects, its positive and negative effects. But the Gilets jaunes, some of you may remember, it used to be the big thing that everybody cared about, not so much anymore. All these flocks of people going to Paris, it was reminiscent of the Women's March on Versailles, believing that they were going to complain to their king as if it was Emmanuel Macron's job to fill the potholes in your street. I mean, this regression to infantilism of treating the head of state or the monarch as a father figure.
Wait, this regression
To infantilism.
No, I understand, but maybe it is people looking for that sort of mythical father
I think
or mother
you're
figure
right.
that he was talking about.
I would only say this is most definitely a human instinct, and I would encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, to regard it with, if not defiance, then grave suspicion. It's just a fact.
Except for in the face of like chaotic technological change, I think it brings a lot of comfort to be reassured of the human
But
touch
comfort
that
is not.
a bureaucracy can't do, and neither can apparently a head of government.
But comfort is not the end-all value here to be sought for. Listen, it's a fact that we come from people who evolved on the African savannah, where rallying around the local tough guy was the way to ensure your survival. And this was true for millions of years. Right? We're finding the tough guy who could beat the brains out of most other tough guys was the best guarantee for your children to be protected. I could never deny that this is deeply ingrained in our psyche and in every fiber of our being. However, we have evolved to a state of consciousness where we can put that back into doubt. Whether it's still sort of feasible to look at the dear leader, the supreme leader, the father figure, or the grandmother that's going to lead us through our troubles and pat us on the back and tell us it's all going to be okay. I'd rather go out by myself in this regard, even if it's risky and more dangerous. I'm sorry, I'm not a recipient of those warm feelings towards the. And by the way, look, I mean, of all the excesses of power that we have in the world, how often is it the dear leader, the supreme leader, the great king, the infallible pope? I mean, history is just strewn with examples of men and women abusing their positions of power. And we have the chance to live in a country where the Constitution is founded on the negation of that. And I would not be so quick.
I think that the message of the Scandinavian monarchies is that they understand that it's inevitable that humans will search that. So we'll install you and cage you, dear monarch, to do our bidding and just be our first diplomat. Be the first diplomat. You take care of the castles. You take care of the national parks. You show up. You shake people's hands, etc. I think that there's something implicit there, and the way that they have set it up, or at least how democracy and monarchy have evolved in those countries.
Well, those monarchs are identified with the state, but not with state power, with
Correct.
state symbolism.
Yeah.
And what they are, they're living logos.
Yeah.
They reign, but do not.
No, wait a second. You're talking, I mean, you're going into the territory of Roland Barthes, and divesting, and this is where I think at least you and I may disagree. They have power. It is the power of their influence as role models and as diplomats of the country, and also as custodians who can see outside of a short-term gain and within the country's prerogatives. So I think they go beyond just.
Well,
logos.
symbolic power, but not political power.
Okay, but political power is not everything. Influence
Right,
is also
right.
something. Cultural, like
That's why they're still
gravitas, is power. But that is
Exactly.
power. It's a different kind of power. I think we saw that Queen Elizabeth had that time.
Stefan, you'd like to say something?
That's been needed. Yes, about
The greater Commonwealth, yeah.
the thinking of the event of instead, it's not say in England or in Canada.
Correct. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
maybe Australia or America.
Yeah.
Yeah, in Ireland, I can tell you it was definitely.
No,
Yeah, and neither was it in Scotland. I mean, for all the adulation and the reverement and the should I say the sad celebrations in Scotland, they reunited the debates of independence.
Well, the monarchy is the only institution that unites the four nations of the UK.
And the Scots have expressed their.
They didn't get rid of the monarchy. Which they.
Well,
They won't get
I
it.
admire,
What?
I admire your confidence.
So Brian, what have we learned?
We have learned that I would say this, I would hearken to another Frenchman, Francois de Caillere, who wrote about the transcendent superiority of diplomacy to the strongman approach. And I think that the notion of civil discourse and the notion of being able to sit around a table and be ensconced with all of these wonderful people is an advance. And I think that if the Queen in her role or people like that in their roles can just bring people to a place where they are talking rather than fighting, that is a success as far as I'm concerned. So that would be my.
I think that's a
would
great
be my-
note on
It's not exactly a monarchic principle.
But she is. 4 billion people to a single moment.
Much the price is right and argue over the pricing of dishwashers. People watch these things, Brian. It's not.
Yes.
I'm not sure there's some sacred thing in this particular one over others.
That is your opinion.
Indeed, it is.
That's what we're here to explore. So thank you all so much. I think that's a good place to stop. Next time we'll be here. It'll be you two, and I'll just let you go all night long.
You know we would.
Thank you again. Thank you. Okey-doke.
Yeah, this time.
Thank you to all who are listening.
The rainy king.
Actually, we'll just leave that.
So where's? So.
Okay, thanks to this Fury.
So. Yes.